Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And later in the program, on Top Gun Day, we look back at one of the most influential naval aviation pictures of all time, Top Gun. But first, the role of the Pentagon Chief Management Officer was created in 2008 to improve the day-to-day operations of the Defense Department, but an independent assessment by the Defense Business Board, ordered by Congress last year, has concluded it's time to scrap the organization and start over. Joining us now is Michael Baer, the chairman of the Defense Business Board, the senior-most panel advising the Defense Secretary on business practices that can improve Pentagon operations. He's also the president of the Dunbarton Strategies Consultancy and one of Washington's most thoughtful defense minds. Michael, thanks very much for joining us.
Vago, it's always a delight to be with you and to be with your audience. Thank you for having me.
It is an absolute pleasure. Lisa Hirschman obviously is heading the Office of the Chief Management Officer. She's the latest in the line. John Gibson held the role before her, and in various guises even before that when it was the Deputy Chief Management Officer. Talk to us a little bit about why the board unanimously concluded that it was time to scrap this organization and start anew.
Well, Vago, thank you for the question. Two things. First is we didn't look at the individuals leading the enterprise. We looked at the enterprise itself. Our focus was how it has performed over the last 12 years. But with a particular emphasis, even though it was statutorily required, our particular emphasis was what's different now. And if you think about its foundations, which actually precede 2008, with Bill Cohen in trying to bring best business practices to the department, for a long time, the benchmark was just that. How can the department be as competitive, if you will, with something like Walmart or FedEx, et cetera, as they're trying to deliver enterprise-wide support services? Our focus was really animated more by the emergence and the clear emergence of a pacing threat, which is China and its hyper-competitive support and industrial base. So our focus was how will this enterprise assess itself, not against the near abstractions of U.S. business enterprises, but more towards the real competitive pressures it faces against China with its rapidly evolving industrial, economic, and diplomatic strength.
You invoked John Hamre's Defense Reform Initiative, the DRI, one of a series of efforts over the past several decades to improve business practices. At one point, there was, transformation was the talk of the town as well. But you guys are suggesting that what's necessary is an actual transformation. If you're going to get rid of the office of the Chief Management Officer, what does it need to be replaced by, and what should its priorities be?
So Vago, our aspirations were that the department focus back tightly on the original transformation responsibilities set forth in statute for the office. And at the same time, divesting all of these distractions, which, although important of themselves individually, really distracted the leadership over this decade or more period of time, with focusing on and delivering those enterprise-wide, deep, sustaining transformational reforms that the department needed. So things like the CIO functions, which that office accumulated, and only recently did the Congress take back away from it, the running of the Pentagon reservation, the night court responsibilities that have recently been aggregated to it. All of those very important functions have been sent to the CMO as a sort of utility infielder, but at the cost of the more fundamental responsibility that that enterprise had in statute, which is to make the entire department far more efficient and lean, and preparing it for this multi-decade contest with the Chinese.
And you say that there are 6 priorities. Walk us through the priorities.
The 6 priorities that we had, I could summarize very simply, which is declutter and focus and resource against it. Those priorities really drive what happens in the enterprise, which is currently called the Chief Management Officer. But we looked beyond that to say that the office of the Deputy Secretary, the office of CAPE, and the office of Controller also need to be beefed up in order for this transition, this transformation, and this transition of transformation responsibilities to be as successful as it can be. The decades from the fall of the wall forward saw a steady erosion in the staffing resources in these critical offices, to the Deputy Secretary, whose office is not even a fraction of the size of Deputy Secretaries' offices in the civil sector. And this Deputy Secretary is responsible with running the largest organization in the US government. CAPE and the Controller as well, critical elements in this, have likewise been decremented over this period of time. And our view was, in order to have an effective, real effective team at the department paying attention to this, that this balance of responsibility, authority, and accountability really needed to be adjusted.
How do you, though, address the fundamental issue that all too often we create organizational functions to save us from habits and cultural problems at the end of the day? This job became a repository for a whole bunch of nits and noids that ended up bogging it down at the end of the day, right? I mean, you said excess amount of clutter. What is the cultural change that's required at the department to generate the kind of transformational, either operational effects or organizational effects, while at the same time helping save money, which has always been a major focus of anybody in, or a major focus of what it is we want this organization to do?
Vago, that's brilliantly recognized. Culture is at the heart of what we saw was the challenge. And in our view today, with the emergence of China, is the pacing threat. That the critical thing to drive culture was establishing a powerful benchmark that would enable the organizations to look at how they're doing vis-a-vis its true competitors. And in order to do that, it needs real, serious net assessment, not static, but dynamic net assessment of the enterprise against its parallel operations in that country. We also saw the need for that same dynamic of net assessment to be applied against the industrial basis, theirs and ours. Our view is that only 2 things change culture: a catastrophe or regular, powerful metrics. And the lack of those metrics have deprived the department of an animating force to help deal with this cultural reluctance to change.
And how would you distribute and get that balance right? Because effectively, the department now has 2 deputy defense secretaries. One is on policy and strategy, and the other one is on management and resources. What's the right way to get that balance right between the 2 of them, ultimately?
Well, it's, again, brilliantly understood because of your decades of involvement with this department. It is unique in that all of this comes together at the deputy secretary's level. In defense, which has no parallel in the civil sectors or in the civil agencies, State Department, Energy, Transportation, or others, the deputy secretary in the Department of Defense is the one-stop shop that controls budgets, policy, and the interaction with the secretary with the warfight. He or she alone has the legitimacy to make the trades, to arbitrate the disputes, and to balance out the pressures that are extant in this kind of a transformation. What we saw over those 12 years is by pulling this responsibility out of the deputy's office, where the integration occurs, setting it up as a satellite, whether it was the ACMO, the assistant chief management officer early on, the deputy chief management officer later, and then the chief management officer today. That established an enterprise separate from the integrating and authoritative position of the deputy secretary. So our focus was to pull it back in under the deputy, eliminate this third independent enterprise for transformation, and keep the focus there, which is so essential to making the department competitive over the long run.
Let me ask you a reasonable savings question, because invariably every administration wants to run the department as well as possible. That's as driving a consideration for Secretary Esper as it was for any of his predecessors. At the end of the day, nobody wants to have a flabby or wasteful operation. But at the end of the day, forecasts, the last administration did a root and branch analysis, as you recall, in the beginning of their tenure to try to identify major muscle movements that could generate savings. And at the end of the day, we perhaps did not generate as much savings as we needed to. What is a reasonable amount of savings, even by massive reconsideration, is reasonable to expect from the department?
So Vago, here's where we're really different than I think some of the previous approaches. We drew a bright distinction between saving money and transformation. They're two very important but very different things. Saving money, more often than not in the department, is very transactional. Transformation, as we define it, is very enduring. So, for example, we looked at the governance structure of the enterprise. Currently, there are 50 governance bodies in the department at the senior levels. The documents which control or guide those organizations are described at some length. A total use of 50 million words are used to describe how those governance enterprises functions. That kind of growth of complexity and density are the things that our view are as important, not more, but as important, and certainly over the longer term, more important than transactional savings around a particular acquisition program. So when you think of the fact that the defense-wide spending, which originally was about 7% of the top line, has expanded to 20% of the top line, and the growth of those agencies and support enterprises have grown during the period of which the force structure has diminished, our view is that should be the focus of transformation. Because if we are to succeed against a nation state whose economy is expanding more rapidly than ours, we have to be hyper efficient at it. That's all about transformation, less about transactional savings.
I think that Admiral Art Zebrowski would be applauding you from heaven as he looks down on your enterprise, and I say that in the kindest possible terms to Admiral Zebrowski, who I think had it right in trying to rethink fundamentally what it was we need to do and what it is that we no longer have to do in a thoughtful manner, especially in resource constrained times. Let me ask you a broader resource question. I mean, the number one topic of parlor conversation, as you know, in Washington now, Michael, is what the outlook for the defense budget is in the wake of several $1 trillion of imposed cost in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Obviously, trillions of dollars in stimulus have gone out. The Fed has been taking actions as well to try to shore up markets and reassure Americans and assure that the economy rebounds as quickly as possible after this unanticipated catastrophe. Even before this crisis, Dr. Esper was very thoughtfully warning everybody that at best, it's going to be slightly up, more likely flat and even declining budgets. there's going to be more downward pressure on budgets. Where do you, as an expert watcher of this, what are your expectations? Where do you think spending goes? And what are the things the department has to do over the next 18 months when there's still money in the pipeline? What are some things the department needs to be doing now to get ready for where we're likely to be in 18 months, 1 year to 2 years?
Vago, that's a terrific question. And I begin by looking less at the pressures from the Congress on the budget than the pressures internally on the budget. The department's capital stock, its principal warfight hardware, is dated, and it's under enormous pressure from competitors who are spending an awful lot of money on advanced capabilities, frankly, some of which they've stolen from us, to use against us. So we're going to have to invest ever increasing amounts of money in order to stay competitive. Matching that against the cost of our people. And if coronavirus has taught us anything, is that we're going to need more people in order to be able to fight through these kinds of things. And then the third piece that I'm concerned about is that over time, the department is going to have to assume a greater portion of protecting itself as well as the nation from these kind of coronavirus specific efforts, very little of which had been invested prior to this. Those three pieces are going to put enormous pressure internally on spending and put lots of pressure on the top line, added to the points you made, which is the scarcity of top line generally and the desire on the increasing desire on the part of Congress to rebalance the defense and non-defense discretionary portfolios.
And to bring it back around, right, all the more pressure for somebody in the department to be overseeing that transformation and some of the major muscle movements that are necessary in order to make sure that we have the right outcomes.
Yes, exactly. Again, if you think about the two functions, the night court efforts of the department are very transactional, highly important, and I take my hat off to Secretary Esper and the courage and dedication he's delivered in order to create that. The other piece, though, is transformation. And the benefits of transformation are measured over decades, the decades at which this struggle between the United States and the Chinese will play out. And in order for us to stay ahead, we have to do both really well. Right now, our judgment was the latter. That is, the transformational effort has been underinvested and underattended to, and we think there needs to be a lot more.
Michael, thanks very much for joining us, and look forward to having you back on to get into a more detailed breakdown of how to think about change. Thanks so much for joining us.
Vago, it's always a delight to be with you.
A quick shout out to our sponsors. Leonardo DRS sponsors our global coverage. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. And Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And joining us now is Buzz Snodgrass, a retired United States Navy commander who was one of the top communicators for former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, who is also the author of the book Holding the Line, Inside Trump's Pentagon with Secretary Mattis. Buzz, always a pleasure having you back on.
Yeah, thanks, Vago. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it very much. And I should point out to our audience that you're a Top Gun graduate. You were also a Top Gun instructor. And later this year, the author of a book that's coming out, Top Gun's Top 10 Leadership Lessons from the Cockpit. First, I want to ask you a little bit about the movie. It's now the 34th anniversary of Top Gun, starring Tom Cruise and many others. We're going to have Top Gun 2 coming out soon as well. When do you remember seeing the movie? I mean, many people saw it in 1986, but tell us when you saw it and what impact it had on your life and your career.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that Top Gun, the movie, is certainly one of the greatest recruiting films that has ever been produced. I mean, you saw a very sharp uptick in the number of applications for people who wanted to join the U.S. Navy specifically, and then, of course, pursue a pathway towards becoming, hopefully, a fighter pilot. I was 10 years old when the movie came out. I was born and raised in Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex in North Texas. I probably shot maybe the year or two after it came out. My dad, I remember he brought home a VHS tape and we watched it together, and I was taken. I loved the movie. We had a naval air station nearby. We also had, at the time, a base called Carswell Air Force Base, where the Thunderbirds, the Blue Angels, had performed. And so I think that sealed the deal for me. I definitely found myself saying I wanted to become a fighter pilot, and I wound up probably watching the movie on average 3 to 4 times a year throughout my middle school and high school years.
That opening sequence has got to be one of the best opening sequences of all time. And when you saw it in a big movie theater and you actually heard the JBD's lock, the jet blast deflector's lock, and the squeal of the tires and everything else was pretty awesome.
It is. One of my favorite pieces of trivia was to ask people, what's the very first line of the movie? And I'm curious if you know. So basically, you've got the Navy lieutenant walks into the Combat Information Center with his cup of coffee, pats a dude on the back and says, "Morning, Scott." And that's literally the very first line of the movie. As they're in that kind of like high stress environment, they're watching the radars with the Russian MiGs coming in towards the fleet. So I love that it's like just this random piece of trivia that, to your point, no one seems to know the answer to.
Wow, I thought you were going to hit me with it was going to be a little bit more sophisticated of a question. And who doesn't love an F-14? I mean, honestly, the Turkey in any guise was an impressive airplane, especially the F-14Ds they had in the picture. Let me ask you a little bit about going to Top Gun. You obviously went to the United States Naval Academy. You became a naval aviator, and then you got selected to go to school, and then eventually went back to be an instructor. And the DNA of the course, for folks, many people who know, the course celebrated its 51st year. It was at the height of the Vietnam War. The United States Navy was trying to get better at air combat maneuvering to improve its win rate over North Vietnamese aircraft like the MiG-17 and the MiG-21. There was a little bit of British DNA in that course because a little bit earlier at Miramar, there were some British pilots who were graduates from the Royal Navy's air warfare instructor course. But talk to us a little bit about some of the things you learned there that made you tactically better and also made you a better leader.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's interesting. At the end of the day, that's what the course is really all about. And no one tells you that. You just realize while you're going through, and then of course, years later, as you rise up through the ranks, that really the course is about leadership. It's about perseverance. It's about striving every single day to challenge yourself to be the very best you can be. And then if you can meet that bar, then do even better the next day. And that's one of the things I loved most about going through the course as an instructor, as a student. And then, like you mentioned, I stayed on with the staff as an instructor for the next few years. But, there's 3 things that the members of the Top Gun staff will tell you that you need to have, basically in equal parts to succeed. You need to have talent, passion, and personality. You have to have at least, a baseline level of talent. You've got to be average or better than average because you have to be credible. You've got to be passionate about it because you're putting in long hours, a lot of time away from the family. You're traveling a lot. And it really is, it's like, as we would call it, a sea tour, where even though you're on shore and you're working as part of a shore-based staff, because of the demands on your time, you better be passionate about what you're doing. Otherwise, you just won't succeed. And the last one, which really is part of the secret sauce, is personality. You have to be someone that your peer group, and especially junior pilots and weapon systems officers, will look at and say, I respect you. You're easy. I can deal with you. You're not arrogant. If you are arrogant, no one's going to want to listen to you. And so you have to have talent, passion, personality in order to not only make your way through the course, but then to succeed as an instructor. And then when you return back to the fleet.
And what I think is interesting is, right, once you get back to the fleet, you're helping train, right? So your DNA is actually spreading across that community and fraternity, as opposed to it just being limited to improving your own skill sets.
That's right. And so that's the model that Top Gun uses. You have, for strike fighter aviation, you have 2 weapons schools. You have one in Lemoore, California. You've got the other one on the East Coast in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And that's where a large number of your Top Gun graduates reside. They are directly responsible for interfacing with each of the fleet squadrons. So they actually deal with the squadron commanding officers, executive officers, all the lieutenants. They're routinely training them. Top Gun's unique because it's basically a role, we would say we're training the trainers. So you would have a very small cadre. Even today, there's about 22 to 25 Top Gun instructors at any given time. And now you're bringing in the best that you can attract to make them the best they can possibly be at tactics, the best they can be at being instructors and leaders. And then most of them go back to the weapon schools and train the fleet. And what you'll do is you'll take maybe 2 or 3 from each class that you handpick that will stay on the Top Gun staff and become an instructor to once again train those who train the fleet.
I want to point out to people that 2 of the coolest patches out there, one of them is the Top Gun patch, which obviously is a MiG-21 with a reticle on it. You know what the other cool patch is, Buzz?
Well, what do you got?
The have not been to Top Gun patch that shows the reticle all the way on one side and the MiG-21 in the other. And I saw that once on a Greyhound, a C2 guy, and I thought that was one of the funniest things that I had ever seen. Talk to us a little bit about the book, Top Gun's Top 10 Leadership Lessons from the Cockpit.
I'm super excited about this project. Had a chance to work with some current and former Top Gun instructors as I was putting it together. One of the things I found myself doing throughout my 20-plus year career was always when you're in a room or when you're in a meeting with a lot of really talented people, there's always 2 or 3 that stand out. And so you find yourselves, you watch them. You kind of wonder, why are they so good at what they do? And so you take those observations and you couple them with what the Top Gun course I felt taught me as I was going through, and then basically putting all those things together in 10 what I called leadership axioms that I used when I was an executive officer and a commanding officer for a fighter squadron in Japan. And I had codified those. I'd shared them in a way I thought was easily accessible. The sailors really enjoyed them. And so now that I'm retired, it's a chance to put those down in a format that's very easily relatable to, basically targeting everyone from high school to probably mid-career to say, look, these are the 10 fundamental tenets that I thought really made a difference in my life. And it's everything from just the basics of the fact that nothing worthwhile is ever easy. I've got another chapter that's on the importance and probably very apropos for the COVID-19 outbreak and pandemic, but that chapter is titled Anticipate Problems. So, right, you want to be able to, as they say, see around corners. You want to be able to anticipate what's coming next so you can put things and guardrails in place so you're not always caught off guard. And then, of course, the last chapter is actually one of my favorite ones, which is don't wait to make a friend until you need one. So it's the importance of developing those networks, developing friendships, and maybe months or years later when you go back and say, hey, I could really use some help, you'll be amazed at how many people will come out to come to your assistance. So it was a fun project. I really enjoyed working on it. I like that it's a smaller form factor. We're not talking 350 pages you have to slog through the history of Top Gun. These are easily digestible chapters that you can pick up and read and make an impact in your life.
Let me ask you one last question, and your expectations for Top Gun 2. Very, very big movie, a lot of anticipation. There's always a concern about whether a sequel is ever going to live up to the original. What are your expectations?
I have high expectations. As you mentioned, the original was just an absolute game changer for that kind of aviation-based industry, for film. Attracted a lot of men and women to the U.S. Navy, into naval aviation. And I can tell you, I guess the best check in the box I can give it is that when I spoke to some of the currently serving Top Gun instructors and said, hey, what is the skinny here? I mean, is this movie going to be great, or is it going to be kind of something that you roll your eyes and say, this is not so good? And they had participated and helped out when the film crew was down. They said, we got a chance to see an advanced screening, and they loved it. They thought it was really good. And they're really excited to see this come out. So if it passed muster with them, I'm going to be pretty excited to take my kids to go see it.
Well, as you said, I mean, Top Gun was just an extraordinary thing that happened in 1986. Was an incredible recruiting film. Generations of naval aviators got attracted to the craft through that, just like Hunt for Red October. You talk to submariners and they just remember watching that movie in 1990, and that attracted them. And obviously folks who read the book in the mid 1980s, and hopefully Greyhound, Tom Hanks's film about Commander Ernest Krause is going to do that for the surface warfare community. I know that folks were hoping Battleship would do it, but I think Greyhound might be a little bit more of a realistic movie on that front.
Midway was kind of a fun movie. Like you said, Top Gun Maverick's coming out December 23rd. You got Greyhound coming out, and I think the timing is fantastic for these movies. It's been as we've talked about previously in one of your episodes, it's been a rough patch of water for the Navy over the last few years, but it looks like Admiral Gilday and the current acting Secretary of the Navy have done a lot to steady the ship, to get things moving in the right direction. And so to cap that off 6 or 7 months from now with these two really terrific movies is going to be great, not only for those actively serving, but for those who are coming behind us, right? The men and women in high school or in college who say, wow, I want to do something really unique with my life. I want an adventure. So they check out the U.S. Navy. And I think that'll be a lot of fun.
I think that movies like that are very important for each of the services at the end of the day to attract a new generation to service. And sometimes it's through those inspirational stories that you can do it. I'm really excited when movies like this come out that then can get another generation attracted. Bus, thanks so much again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, always a pleasure, Vago. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman and our broader Navy coverage that's sponsored by Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.